Morning. Sorry, I was looking for a passage in Lamentations. Anyone know where the passage in Lamentations is that our song that we just sung was based on? I was looking for Jeremiah's sentiment there. But anyway, the book of Lamentations. Anyone know what Lamentations was a lament concerning? Anyone know what?
Concerning the fate of Israel, it's such dire circumstances.
What?
And because the people have been overcome through their own sin.
Exactly. And the prophet Jeremiah stood and watched as Jerusalem itself was burned to the ground. And as he's witnessing the destruction of all that was near and dear to him, he used those words by inspiration. Great is thy faithfulness, and great is God's mercy, and his mercy is renewed every day. And it's amazing when you think about the positive outlook he could have under such dire circumstances. But it kind of brings us into our lesson today. By the way, Brian is not able to be with us today because he's sick, and his wife is sick, and they have been sick for several days now. And we certainly hope that they will be well soon. But he texted me this morning and said, I won't be able to be there. So here I am, and I'm going to do my best to try to fill in for him. I'm not going to be dealing with any of the things he's been dealing with. Instead, I want to kind of set the stage for a new class that, Lord's willing, will begin this Wednesday evening. If you have not been attending Wednesday evenings, I encourage you to do that. We'll be studying the book of Isaiah. And we haven't started yet. You might call today a preamble to that study. We're not really actually going to get into Isaiah. We may, it depends on how much time I ramble. But if we don't ramble too much, we will, or if we ramble too little rather, we'll probably touch on Isaiah at least in part. But I want to begin with this thought. We tend to honor those in our society and even in our midst that we deem to be great servants. We think about teachers, Teacher of the Year awards. It's a great thing if you can achieve that designation, that status, to be considered by your peers, by your administrators, to be the best teacher at your school, and to think of yourself in terms of molding and shaping the minds of young people. And so you like to think in terms of honoring our teachers in our schools because they're doing what we consider to be a good work. Or maybe we take time to honor our civil servants, the firemen, policemen, the ambulance drivers, the people that we rely on in our time of need. So we're thankful for them, and sometimes we seek ways to honor them. We certainly admire their work. And I know in this congregation we hear prayers being offered many times for those civil servants of ours. And then we think about military personnel. And we know sometimes that our president will even take occasion to greatly honor certain of our servicemen and women who've done extraordinary things on the battlefield. They've gone above and beyond the call of duty, perhaps. And so our president will give them, the Medal of Honor or whatever will be conferred upon them because we recognize the great service these men and women are providing our nation, and we rightly appreciate and honor their service. When I think of the great men of the world, in my mind, I think about the prophets. Particularly the prophets of the Old Testament and even the prophets of the New Testament era. We rarely stop to think about the great contribution these prophets have made in the world, but they've made a great contribution. And we'll see, hopefully, prayerfully, in our study of Isaiah, some of those contributions that have been made. But I do know one thing, ranking among the greatest of the great would be the prophets. Certainly, the Lord thought this, and the Lord thought very highly of the prophets. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." Rejoice and be exceedingly glad. For great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Jesus is saying to us, when people treat you badly and say bad things about you, and certainly things without warrant or justification, then you should be glad, because you're counted among that class of men he described as the prophets. And so you're ranked among the prophets. You're ranked among the great people. That's what the Lord, in essence, is saying. The Hebrew writer thought the same thing. In Hebrews chapter 11, beginning of verse 32, what shall I say the more? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Till others had a trial of mockings and scourging, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sown in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. Now, when you think about someone who lives like that, who lives out in deserts and caves, has no certain dwelling place, do you think of this individual as an honorable person? Someone that you would highly esteem? Probably not. You might think he had a few loose screws. I mean, what would you think of Elijah? Or what would you think of John the Baptist, who lived out in the wilderness, ate bugs? I mean, what would you think of such an individual? Eccentric? Maybe he needs some medication. Maybe he was mistreated as a child. I mean, you probably think a lot of things about these prophets when you really stop and think about it. And yet, notice what the Hebrew writer said about them. These men are living this way, but the world didn't deserve them. The world wasn't worthy of them. What does that mean, the world was not worthy of them? It means they were better than the average person. They were not like the run and meal individual. They stood head and shoulders above. I remember as a young preacher, I mean, I'm talking my early 20s. I started when I was 20 years old, full-time preaching. Had a lot of people that would try from time to time to encourage me. Don't be discouraged. Now, all you can do is you can lead a horse to the trough, but you can't make him drink. I don't know what that means exactly. I never rode a horse. But maybe we're talking about donkeys. I don't know. But if you're thinking about, something that works for me in my mind, I'm not sure that's what I'm dealing with. But most people would think that if a preacher ever got discouraged or disheartened, it's because people weren't running down the aisle to jump in the baptistry or to ask for the prayers of the church, and there just wasn't a whole-scale revival going on every Sunday. That kind of thing didn't really bother me. I mean, I did think there were many times that people should respond, man, they're going to come running down the aisle when I preach this sermon. Like, really? That's it? And then other times I would just be flopped. I mean, it was a dud of a sermon, and people are running down the aisle, knocking me down. I'm like, well, what was that all about? I mean, and I come to realize over time, it's like I was saying a moment ago, it's not about me. So I learned a valuable lesson as a young preacher. It's not me. It's not how good I present it or what I'm saying necessarily. It's whether or not the Lord blessing those words and whether or not they're having the desired effect. I mean, that's what really counts. And so you learn that over time. But people would try to encourage me. And I think a lot of times they would try to encourage me because, well, I don't know if it's news to you or not, but being a preacher, you make a lot of enemies. You just do. It's not that you're trying to. It's not that you want to. In fact, I can only speak for myself, but I think I'm speaking for most preachers. I think most preachers want to be liked by the congregation they're preaching to and for because they like that congregation. They like those people, and they want the best for those people. But preachers quickly learn a lot of times people in the congregation don't feel the same way about you that you do about them. And as a person, as a human being, that can be disheartening. Well, I liked you. I thought we were okay, and you don't like me. And I don't know why you don't like me, but you don't like me. Sometimes I think it's because I'm bald-headed, or maybe because I don't speak loud enough, or do I speak loud enough? Can you hear me okay? Who said yes over it? That was you, Marlene, wasn't it? You're probably thinking that was the opposite, right? But, huh? No, it's just about right? Oh, okay. Well, good. Thank you. All right, so you can hear me without having a strain. That's good. Nobody wants to be disliked. And I'll put it to you this way. The older I get, the less inclined I am to accept hatred because I'm doing the right thing. Here's what gets me about preaching. Not so much, preacher, what you said, it's how you said it. How are you supposed to say whatever it is you're supposed to say? I mean, I try my level best to be respectful. Now, when I'm preaching in a public service, I'm going to present a certain persona. It's going to come across a certain way because I'm hitting a lot of people, a lot of different directions. But when I'm talking one-on-one, I generally try to be halfway decent. At least I smile when I say, you're probably not going to go to the pearly gates. I'm trying to smile when I say that, but there's no way to say that to someone so that when they leave your presence, they can say, man, I really appreciate him telling me I'm going to the bad place. I just really enjoy hearing that. I don't know many people that want to hear their preacher say that. And I've come to the conclusion that what they want to hear from the preacher is what they want to hear. They want the preacher to say what they want him to say. Isaiah learned that. Jeremiah learned that. Amos certainly learned that. A lot of all the prophets, in fact, they learned that same lesson. People are not interested, really, truly, when you get right down to it, in hearing the truth, particularly when it involves themselves. Now, you tell Brother so-and-so where he's going to go. Mm-hmm. But now me, you be careful of what you say to me. Well, if a preacher or a prophet is going to do his job, if he's going to be a faithful minister in the kingdom of God, he's got to speak the truth regardless of what people may say about him. Now, does he need to say it mean? No. Does he need to be ugly about it? No. Does he need to be considerate of people's circumstance, situation? Of course. All that's got to be considered. But I'm just here to tell you, you can do all of that and then some, and still at the end of the day, he's just not a very nice person. He said mean things to me. That's just the state of preaching. I don't take it personally. Well, I do, and I don't. I understand it. It bothers me, but I understand it. I can get my mind around that because I don't want to hear things I don't want to hear either. And so I'm just going to go after but I have also learned that generally when they come after the preacher, it's not about the real issue at hand. They come up with some other issue, and they come after you with whatever that other issue is because they don't want to admit that you were stomping on my toes. So they come after you for some other reason. But be that as it may, I like to think in terms of whether you're a preacher like me or whether you're just talking to people on the job or family members and you have ruffled some feathers. And you go home and you're lying in bed at night and you're thinking to yourself, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I should have just kept it to myself. Maybe I shouldn't have stirred the pot. Remember what Jesus said, blessed are you when men shall revile you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. What did they say about Jesus? And was he mean? Was Jesus an unkind individual? Was Jesus hateful? No. He was probably far stronger in his preaching and presentation than I've ever dreamed of being. But no, he wasn't mean, and he wasn't hateful. He wasn't unkind. But they crucified him. They crucified him because he came promising life and liberty, freedom from sin, those kinds of wonderful things, and love of fellow man and love of God, purity of life. And so they crucified him. And that's going to be the case with you, whether you're preaching in a pulpit or whether you're preaching on the job or whether you're talking to family members. The world isn't going to like it. And that's one of the lessons we can glean from the prophets. Notice again in Matthew 23:34, Jesus said, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you shall kill and crucify, and some of them you shall scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city. that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. Interesting, he mentions Abel in this light. Now, Abel was a righteous man. We know that. The Hebrew writer confirms that. The book of Genesis shows us that. So we know he was a righteous man, but Zacharias was a prophet, and he mentions Abel and Zacharias in the context of the prophets being persecuted. It makes you wonder, was Abel also a prophet? We do know that the seventh from Adam, according to the book of Jude, was a prophet. So prophets did exist in the early days of humanity. And so we could make the point, I suppose, and argue the case that perhaps Abel was also a prophet. And it could be that he prophesied to his brother concerning his offering, and that's why his brother killed him. Who knows? I mean, there's not a whole lot of information actually given in the book of Genesis. We just have the highlights. But Jesus certainly included him with Zacharias. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 15, as we're thinking about the prophets and the burden of the prophets, I want you to consider the young man Samuel, who has been essentially raised by Eli. Remember, the mother, Hannah, of Samuel, had not had a child, had not had a son, and so she went to the tabernacle and she poured her heart out in prayer to God, so much so that Eli thought she was drunk. I mean, she was Bluetoothing, God, and he thought, well, she's over here talking to herself, and so she's drunk, and that's what he thought. She was asking God for a son, and so she was granted that petition, and she was given Samuel. But her promise was, if you give me a son, I'll give him back to the Lord, and she did. So she gave Samuel to the care of Eli, and so Eli raised Samuel. So you might argue, and rightly so, that Eli was the father figure for Samuel. In chapter 3, verse 15 of 1 Samuel, Samuel lay until the morning and opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel feared to show Eli the vision he had received in the night. Remember that vision that was prefaced with his name, Samuel. And when he heard his name audibly spoken, he thought Eli was calling to him, so he ran and he asked his master, yes, what do you want? And Eli said, I didn't call you. Go lay down. So he went and laid down again, and God spoke to him again, Samuel. So we went back to Eli, and Eli finally just said, enough of this. Look, if you hear this voice again, it's probably the Lord, and this is what you should say. Speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And so that's what he did. And so God told him something that he had to share with Eli, his father figure, his caretaker, his master. That was a very unpleasant thing to share with him. So Eli, verse 16, called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he answered, here am I. And he said, what is the thing that the Lord said to you? I pray, hide it not from me. God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all things that he said to you. And Samuel told him every word and hid nothing from him. And he said, it is the Lord, let him do what seemed him good. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. It's a good thing that Eli was willing to accept this harsh judgment from God, particularly spoken by whom he called his son, Samuel. But he did accept it. But I want you to put yourself in Samuel's sandals for a moment. Who wants to tell their father, God's going to judge you? And it's not going to be a pleasant thing for you. Who wants to be the bearer of that kind of news? But Samuel was again ranked among the prophets. And that's what's required of prophets, is the courage and yes, the love to speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's the burden of preaching. Now consider with me the one that the Lord may have been referring to in Matthew 23, from 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verse 17. This is, I believe, the one that the Lord was probably referring to. After the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them. They abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and worshiped Asherah poles and idols. Because of their guilt, God's anger came upon Judah and Jerusalem. Although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to him, and though they testified against him, they would not listen. I think, speaking from personal experience, that's the hardest thing to accept as a preacher. They just won't listen. You can preach and preach your heart out, and they're just not listening. They're just not paying attention. Or maybe they hear what you're saying, but they ain't going to do it. It's just no more complicated than that. So the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, the priest, who stood before the people and said, "This is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's commands? You will not prosper because you have forsaken the Lord. He has forsaken you." The essence of what I just preached this morning is that if the Lord forsakes us, then we're forsaken for sure. If the Lord is with us, then we have nothing to fear because the battle is the Lord's. And this is essentially what Zechariah is saying. You keep living this way, and God's not going to prosper you. But because you've forsaken the Lord, he's forsaken you. So they plotted against him, and by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. King Joash did not remember the kindness Zechariah's father Jehoiada had shown him, but killed his son, who said as he lay dying, "May the Lord see this and call you to account." I don't imagine anyone wants to be stoned to death, but here's a man that was stoned to death because he simply stated the truth. And even though there had kindness been shown to this king by this man's father, he didn't remember that, didn't care. That didn't matter. He said something I didn't like, I don't agree with it, so let's just brutally murder him. And that's the lot of the prophets. Jeremiah would learn in Jeremiah 1 verse 9, "The Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. I've set you this day over the nations, over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant." That's interesting. So I want you to tear up, rip up, destroy, and then I want you to rebuild. If you've ever plowed a field, a new field, you have to cut down the trees or push the trees over. But once the trees are gone, you have to dig up the stumps and the roots and get the rocks out of the way. You've got to clear the field before you can even plow it. But you clear the field, and then you plow the field, and then you plant the seed. And I think in essence that's what the Lord is describing here to Jeremiah. That is your role. That is your work. As a prophet, I want you to take these arguments and these ideas and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and I want you to go to work reasoning with them to destroy those arguments, to tear them down, so that you can preach the truth and tell them the things they need to hear, to plant the seed of truth in their hearts and minds. That is in essence the work that Jeremiah learned. And that is in essence the work of every preacher today. 2 Timothy 4. Preach the word. Be instant, in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and what? Exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. Now there's two negatives here and one positive, but there's two negatives. Reprove and rebuke. No one likes that part. We all like the Joel Osteen part. We want to be exhorted, but we don't want to have anyone tell us we did anything wrong before we get to the... But we have to first tear down before we can build up. We've got to say, this is not the way to live, but this is the way we should live. And I think oftentimes we want the good part without hearing all the negative stuff that I have to give up. I don't want to give up the way I'm living. I want to continue doing what I'm doing. I want you to tell me I'm okay to do what I'm doing. Speak to us smooth things. Prophesy deceits. That's what they said to Isaiah. as we will see in our study. And yes, we will get past chapter 5, Lord's willing, in our study of the book of Isaiah when we get there. And I believe you'll see in time. Any questions or comments about prophets or that you would like to add here? All right. I now call your attention to the prophet Isaiah. Do some preliminary background work here before we begin our study. In Acts chapter 8, just kind of start here. You remember the account of the Ethiopian eunuch. As he's riding in his chariot, he was reading what? Or from what? Reading the prophet Isaiah. And so when Philip joins the chariot, he said, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he said, "How can I unless someone guides me?" He brought him up into the chariot. And notice what the eunuch said. "Of whom is the prophet speaking this? Of himself or of some other man?" Those are powerful thoughts when it comes to understanding any book of the Bible, particularly the prophets. If you want to understand the message of the prophets, you have to answer basic questions. Who's the prophet talking about? And what's he saying? And what's his message to them before you can possibly understand what the message and or significance may be to you? You have to first of all put it back in its historical context. Well, what did it mean then? And what was he saying to those people? And so Acts 8, the Ethiopian eunuch, certainly will be on the back of our minds as we study through the chapters of Isaiah, and there are many of them. And as we try to understand his message, we're going to try to understand the world and the context historically in which Isaiah was doing just that. Now, let me begin by noting this. We have in our Bibles 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I'm sure you've noticed as you study these 4 books that they're almost identical in some respects, they're similar in other respects, and very different in other respects. And they're written from a different perspective. The 1st and 2nd Kings is more what you might think of as court records. These are records of the kings. Maybe some court scribe or whatever just writing and recording the events of the day. We might say this is just fair and balanced news. Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a little different. It's written from the perspective of a priest. So there's much more of a theological spin on the events that are recorded. So you're reading some of the same events, but there's a lot of commentary, inspired commentary, that goes with those events, and it's very enlightening because it gives you insight and understanding into what was really happening with some of those. So it's very powerful to read all of these. But as you read 1st and 2nd Kings, one of the first things that's going to blow your mind is the chronology. You're going to read a couple of chapters, and you're going to be around 970 BC. Say, all right, we're moving along. And then you're going to read the next chapter, and you're back up in 920 BC or maybe 890 BC. You go, wait a minute, I thought I had moved over here, and now I'm back over there. And you're over here and over there, and you're reading about the king of Israel and the king of Judah, and you're going, I can't keep up with what we're doing here. Well, if we understand 1st and 2nd Kings and what's going on, he's really discussing 2 separate kingdoms. Because after Solomon died, the 3rd king of the United Kingdom, after Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over. And the people, the elders of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, were very insistent that some of the burden, taxes especially, that were placed on their people be lightened by Rehoboam. And you remember Rehoboam consulted with the older men who had counseled with his father, Solomon, and they said, you need to listen to these people. You need to listen to them. Then he consulted with the younger men who, in essence, said, you go back and tell them you're the king in charge here, and they ain't seen nothing yet. That's paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what he said. And that's the advice he took, unfortunately, the hot-headed youth. And so he went back and told the 10 northern tribe leaders what these young men had said, and they said, well, you can have it then. We're not going to be serving you any longer. And so Jeroboam was anointed their first king in what would become the northern nation of Israel, distinct and separate now from the southern nation of Judah. And so we have different dynasties, we have separate kingdoms, And yet, we have Jewish people, we have prophets in the northern and in the southern kingdom. So if you're looking at it that way, it's like it just all confused and muddied in your mind. It's like, I can't keep up with it. Well, hopefully we'll try to clarify some of that as we go through our study. But as you read 1st and 2nd Kings, you read about the division of the kingdom, you realize that there are two separate nations. Now, when we read the prophet Isaiah, we're primarily concerned with which kingdom? Anyone know? Who was his primary concern with? At least the first 12 chapters. No. No, he was a southern prophet. He was concerned primarily with Judah, and much of what he had to say was directed to them. But as a prophet, he also spoke about the neighboring nations. And he talked a great deal about the neighboring nations. And I think sometimes that's why it's confusing to us today, because we live in this culture that says we should have a separation of church and state. Indeed, we are not a theocracy. I'm not going to try to get into Brian Mitchell's business here, but we're not a theocracy. Okay, so we're not like Israel of old, where we have God literally in charge of our government. But we have something, at least initially, that was very close to that. At least from the founding fathers' perspective, they wanted something very much like that. They wanted to have a nation of free men and women who were free because God was their king, and God was their governor, and God was in charge of their lives. And so morally, religiously, the people were going to guide themselves. And so that's what they originally established. When we go back to the prophets, Isaiah included in that number, there's going to be a lot of discussion about politics, political alliances, and who are you really counting on? Who are you really leaning on? The great burden of Isaiah pretty much was the same message I preached this morning. Because the people of Judah continued to rely on their political alliances. If we can have the right political alliances, we won't have to worry about the Assyrians or the Syrians or any other threat to us, because we've got the right alliances. And Isaiah was, God is your alliance. God is the one you should be counting on, not these other nations. And so over and over again, Isaiah is trying to plead with the kings and the others, don't look elsewhere, look heavenward, and let God be your deliverer, your king, and your savior. But certainly, there was a lot of political discussion that took place with the prophets, and we'll see that when we get into Isaiah. His ministry extended at least 50 years. It began probably, 190 years after the division of the kingdoms. So the kingdoms have been divided. Israel is about to fall, and Judah is not far behind. And so he's on the tail end of things when it comes, as I mentioned a moment ago, to the division of the kingdoms. Some tragic things are noted about him from Jewish history that I'll share with you. Most Jewish rabbis agree that the reference in Hebrews 11 to being sewn asunder is a reference to Isaiah being sewn in half from top to bottom. It is suggested by the rabbis that he was placed in a hollow log, and a huge bow saw was used, men on either side pulling the bow saw through the log, and sewed him in half while he was alive. And so the reference to sewn asunder, or sewn in two, the modern translations say, would be a reference to Isaiah. That would have been his end at the hands of Manasseh. You remember I mentioned Manasseh just the other night, who filled Jerusalem with blood, with innocent blood. And if the Jewish rabbis are correct, some of that innocent blood would have been this prophet. The prophets suffered horribly. And so Jesus rightly commended them to us and urged us to be like them, and even reminded us we should be glad when we find ourselves in their company. He was married, Isaiah was, and he had at least two sons. The name of one son was Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. I don't know about you, but when I read these names, I think that's a form of child abuse. Why would you do your child that way? I mean, you can't even nickname him. How do you shorten that? Mahir Shalal Halbaz, meaning hasten to the spoil and rush on the prey. He was a little nicer to the second son, Shir Jasub, meaning a remnant shall return. So much of the message that Isaiah was preaching is reflected in the naming of his sons according to God's direction. According to, again, Jewish tradition and the rabbis' teaching, Amos, the Z, not Amos, but Amos, was a brother of King Amaziah of Judah, reigned from 797 to 767, and like his son Isaiah, also a prophet. And so when you hear Isaiah is the son of Amos, this is who he's referring to. So Isaiah had royal blood, in essence, in him, and was connected to the royal family. There were prophets who came before him, mostly non-writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha. But during his time and just prior to his time, the writing prophets exploded onto the scene, like Joel and Amos and Hosea and Micah. These are prophets of the northern nation, yes, that were writing their messages. But, just because a prophet is writing his message, as we refer to them as the writing prophets, as opposed to just one who spoke, doesn't mean that one's more important than the other. It's kind of like saying major prophets and minor prophets. One just wrote more than the other. And I don't know about you, but we like preachers that are short-winded. And so when you think of the minor prophets, I think they're probably more popular than the major prophets because you can read them in one sitting. They're just 3 or 4 chapters, most of them. And sometimes there's 1 or 2 chapters. You can get done with that in a hurry. Isaiah's over 60 chapters. I mean, it's going to take a while to get through it. So we won't be able to discuss every chapter at length. So I just want you to be aware of that before we get started. But nevertheless, he did come around the same time. Of course, he and Micah were contemporaries, and his book can be divided into 2 main parts. There's chapters 1 through 39, and there's chapters 40 through 66, but there's subdivisions as well. The first 12 chapters, of course, are directed exclusively to Judah and Jerusalem and what was happening there. Chapters 13 to 27, judgment against the nations, which had an impact or an influence on Judah and, yes, of Israel. Isaiah was quoted by Jesus more than any other prophet. If you're reading a commentary on the book of Isaiah, the likelihood of your reading something about 2 Isaiahs will come up. Meaning one was written at one time frame, another written in another time frame by different individuals. And of course, Isaiah, the prophet himself, is not the author of these words. And so from those old German liberal theologians, you're going to get a lot of this influence that suggests that Isaiah is really not one book. It shouldn't be counted that way, shouldn't be thought of that way, and everything about it should be questioned. I respond to all of that gibberish this way. Jesus endorsed Isaiah, and as a Christian, I don't have to go any further than that, because if anyone can rise from the dead, I'm going to believe what they say, and I'm going to accept what they endorse. And clearly, Jesus accepted Isaiah and quoted it extensively from all parts of Isaiah, as we will see in our study. For example, Matthew 13 and verse 13. Jesus said, I speak to them in parables because seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and not understand, seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them. And then in Matthew 15, verse 7, Jesus, again, responding to the critics of his day against himself, he said, you're hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth, honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching a doctrine, the commandments of men. And on we could go, explaining and showing how Jesus would quote from the prophet Isaiah. And much of what we commonly refer to as quotes from the Old Testament came right out of the book of Isaiah. So I'm kind of excited about this study, as I hope that you will be. I think our time has expired this morning. Any questions or comments about Isaiah? I don't want to begin reading the text. we'll do that, I guess, Wednesday evening. I do ask you to read at least the first chapter, and we'll probably be there a while. Yes, you had a comment, or no? It's your glad. Okay. Anything you'd like to say further about bell's about to ring? Better hurry. All right. Sorry. Thank you.